Do any of you have plans to record on your own?
We do at home. We might.
In fact, we have done, I think.
Have we?
Well, Eleanor Rigby was Paul on his own, and
We were just drinking tea.
Death is a subject normally avoided in pop music. Where acknowledged, it is either sanitized with heavenly choirs or treated as a black joke. Consequently, the downbeat demise of a lonely spinster in Eleanor Rigby, not to mention the brutal image of the priest wiping the dirt from his hands as he walks from the grave, came as quite a shock to pop listeners in 1966. Taken together with George Martin's wintry string octet arrangement, the impact was transfixing. According to Paul, Eleanor Rigby began as a plain tune with a melancholy descending phrase and the image of a spinster, Miss Daisy Hawkins, sweeping up the rice in a church after a marriage. Meeting Jane Asher in Bristol, where she was working in rep, Paul allegedly got the name Rigby from a clothes shop, adding Eleanor from Eleanor Braun, the actress who played the female lead in Help.
When I got back to London, I wrote the song in Mrs. Asher's music room in the basement of 57 Wimpole Street, where I was living at the time. Around that same time, I'd started taking piano lessons again. I took lessons as a kid, but it was mostly just practicing scales, and it seemed more like homework. Jane's mum, Margaret, organised lessons for me with someone from Guildhall School of Music, where she worked. I even played Eleanor Rigby on piano for the teacher. But this was before I had the words. At the time, I was just blocking out the lyrics and singing over vamped D minor chords. I don't remember the teacher being all that impressed. They just wanted to hear me play even more scales, so that was the end to the lessons. When I started working on the words in earnest, Eleanor was always part of the equation. I think because we'd worked with Eleanor Braun on the film Help, and we knew her from the establishment Peter Cook's Club on Greek Street. I think John might have dated her for a while too, and I liked the name very much. The song itself was consciously written to evoke the subject of loneliness, with the hope that we could get listeners to empathize.
Although the song was still in its early stages, Paul wasn't fond of the name Daisy Hawkins. However, he had enough of the song's structure to share it with others, including his friend and fellow musician, Donovan Leitch. Since Donovan lived nearby in Maida Vale, Paul stopped by and gave him a first listen. One day I was on my own in the pad, running through a few tunes on my Ur tape recorder, Donovan remembers. The doorbell rang. It was Paul on his own. We jammed a bit. He played me a tune about a strange chap, the protagonist, called Ola Natunji, blowing his mind in the dark with a pipe full of clay, no one can say. The words hadn't yet come out right for him. Regarding the name of the main character, Paul relates, but I wasn't comfortable with the name Miss Hawkins. I didn't think it sounded real enough. I knew I could do better then. I wanted a really nice name that didn't sound wrong. It had to sound like someone's name, but different enough and wasn't just Valerie Higgins, you know. It had to be a little more evocative. I'm always keen to get a name that sounds right. Now for a serendipitous twist, Paul relates. Seems that up in Woolton Cemetery, where I used to hang out a lot with John, there's a gravestone to an Eleanor Rigby. In the 80s, a gravestone was discovered in the cemetery of St. Peter's Parish Church in Woolton, Liverpool. This site was only a short distance from where John and Paul had their first encounter back in 1957. It was either complete coincidence or in my subconscious, Paul continues. I suppose it was more likely in my subconscious, because I will have been amongst those graves knocking about with John and wandering through there. It was the sort of place we used to sunbathe, and we probably had a crafty fag in the graveyard. But there could be 3,000 gravestones in Britain with Eleanor Rigby on. It is possible that I saw it and subconsciously remembered it, so subconscious it may be, but this is just bigger than me. I don't know the answer to that one. Coincidence is just a word that says two things coincided. We rely on it as an explanation, but it actually just names it. It goes no further than that. But as to why they happened together, there are probably far deeper reasons that our little brains can't grasp. Armed with only the first verse, Paul headed for John's house at Weybridge, where, During an informal evening with friends, he and the other Beatles pieced the rest of the song together. Starting as Father McCartney, the priest in the second verse soon became the neutral Father Mackenzie, a name found by consulting with the telephone directory. Ringo suggested the idea of him darning his socks in the night. The refrain, "Ah, look at the lonely people," seems to have been designed by a committee, possibly later in the studio, where some say the last verse was decided. Others maintain that the song was completed during the same evening. John, who subsequently claimed about 70% of the lyric, apparently tried to quash the idea of its two characters meeting at the end. In fact, the song's grim final verse was settled on only after much head-scratching and at the last minute. In various interviews, John suggested that he had played a significant role in the song's creation. In a 1972 interview with Hit Parader magazine, when questioned about the song, John said, "Both of us. I wrote a good lot of the lyrics, about 70%. In 1980, he claimed, Eleanor Rigby was Paul's baby, and I helped with the education of the child."
Yeah, Rigby's, his first verse and the rest of the verse are basically mine, but the way he did it was he had the song and he knew he got the song. So rather than ask me, John, do these lyrics, because by that period, he didn't want to say that to me, okay? So what he said was, hey, you guys, finish up the lyrics, while he's sort of fiddling around with the track or something, or arranging it at the other part of the giant studio in EMI. Now, I sat there with Mal Evans, a road manager who was a telephone installer, and Neil Aspinall, who was a not completed student accountant, who became our road manager. And I was insulted and hurt that he'd thrown it out in the air, but I wanted to grab a piece of it, and I wrote it with them sitting at the table. So, you know, there might be a version that they contributed, but there isn't a line in there that they put in. But that's how he just sort of, because that's the kind of insensitivity he would have, which made me upset in the later years, because to him that meant nothing. That's the kind of person he is. So he threw them out and said, here, finish these off, like to anybody, you know, who was around. But actually meant I was to do it, but, you know, Neil and Mal were sitting there. But...
Pete Shotton, a close friend who was present during the songwriting session, remembered the specifics. Most of the song was written in John's music room at his house in Kenwood during one of my weekend visits. The other three Beatles and their wives had come over for dinner, and after which, we all gathered around the television in Sin's beloved library. This particular night, John grew bored with the TV program. He said, "Let's go upstairs and play a bit of music." Paul, George, and Ringo duly followed John upstairs to a room adjoining his little recording studio. Paul, as always, had brought along his guitar, which he got out and began strumming. "I've got this little tune here," he said. "It keeps popping into my head, but I haven't gotten very far with it." Then he sang the beginning of Eleanor Rigby. We all sat around, making suggestions, throwing out the odd line or phrase. All of us, that is, except for the Beatle who had proposed the session in the first place. Another concern was the lyrical content of the final verse. Pete Shotton continues, "After we tinkered with a few more phrases, Paul said, 'The real trouble is I have no idea how to finish the song.' I said, 'Why didn't you have Eleanor Rigby dying and have Father Mackenzie doing the burial service for her? That way you'd have the two lonely people coming together in the end, but too late.' John then piped in with his first comment of the entire session. 'I don't think you understand what we're trying to get at, Pete.' All I could think of to say was, 'F you, John.' Paul packed his guitar away, and we all wandered out of the room. Even after George produced a joint to lighten up the mood, I continued to feel more than a little bit uptight about John's unwanted sarcasm. Maybe my great suggestion hadn't been so great after all, though John was to take credit in one of his last interviews for most of the lyrics. My own recollection is that Eleanor Rigby was one Lennon-McCartney classic in which John's composition was virtually nil.
Part of it we worked on together, the lyrics too, if you want to get into that song, because he had the first lines about Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church when there's nobody there. And we worked in a room together on it somewhere to finish off a verse and a bit, and then the rest of it was finished off in the studio, with me sitting at the table, thinking, how dare he throw it in the air like that? Yeah.
Would he envision the theme This is about loneliness and...
Oh, he had the whole thing about Eleanor Rigby sits in the right of the church with the red in his bin. What's that?
Lives in a dream.
I don't know if he had lives in a dream, but that was the theme, you know, and he had the story, knew where it was going, so... He only had the first verse, he didn't have the middle eight. Oh, look at all the lonely people. That bit, which was sort of...
And
They settled on that, he and George Harrison were settling on that as I left the room, and I turned around and said, that's it?
To confirm that some of the song's lyrics were indeed finished in the recording studio, Hit Parader magazine asked producer George Martin in 1971 to clarify the confusion surrounding the song's writing process. "I had assumed that it was all Paul," he replied, adding, "In fact, I do remember, actually at the recording, Paul was missing a few lyrics and wanting them, and going around and asking people, 'What can we put in here?' And Neil and Mal were coming up with suggestions. Pretty petty, really. Everyone contributed things occasionally." Another intriguing comment came from Paul himself in a conversation with the Beatles' official biographer, Hunter Davies. This was later published in the 1985 edition of The Beatles, the authorized biography, where Paul stated, "I saw somewhere that he, John, says he helped on Eleanor Rigby." Yeah, about half a line. Author Barry Miles concurs. It seems as though John backed himself into a corner and couldn't find a way to save face, because a less likely John Lennon composition would be hard to find. After hearing Paul play this beautiful song on acoustic guitar, Jeff Emerick reveals, George Martin felt that the only accompaniment that was necessary was that of a double-string quartet. 4 violins, 2 violas, and 2 cellos. Paul wasn't immediately enamored of the concept. He was afraid of it sounding too cloying, too Mancini. But George eventually talked him into it, assuring him that he would write a string arrangement that would be suitable. "Okay, but I want the strings to sound really biting," Paul warned as he signed off on the idea. Not long after George Martin was introduced to the song, he and Paul met at Martin's house to work on the arrangement, much like they had done the previous year with Yesterday. "Paul came around to my flat one day, and he played the piano, and I played the piano," Martin remembers, "and I took a note of his music. I was very much inspired by Bernard Herrmann, and a particular score he did for the Truffaut film, Fahrenheit 451. That really inspired me, especially the strident string writing. When Paul told me he wanted the strings in Eleanor Rigby to be doing a rhythm, it was Herrmann's score which was a particular influence."
Yeah, I brought it in like Eleanor Rigby, and then George would show me. He said, "Well, okay, that's sort of rock and roll. It's all pretty much in one octave." But he would then say, "Okay, so the cello would go there, and then the viola would go there, and then..." So he would separate all the notes.
Yeah.
And that's a fabulous orchestration that he did.
And this doesn't have the piano in it. You wrote it on the piano and then decided to...
Yeah, that was the thing, because, yesterday there'd just been the one guitar.
Yeah.
So we decided we'd kind of try and go a little bit further.
Yeah.
And just have this. And then I would sing to this, so I'd show George the chords. He would then transpose it. And then George would talk to the musicians, sort of say, dum, dum, dum. I want it kind of really bam, bam, quite bright, staccato, dun, 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 dun. And they got into it. Yeah. They loved it. It's a nice little arrangement on its own.
Yeah.
And then I sang it, and I didn't think I was singing it well. I remember talking to George, "I'm not singing this." He said, "No, it's okay. It's good." And he was calming me down. And then we double-tracked it. I think probably because I didn't think I'd sung it well. So they were letting it double-track it. We cover any sins.
When you first heard it played by the octet, what was the feeling like?
It was very exciting, actually. Downstairs in Abbey Road, the 8 guys assembled, and they did it live.
Did you listen from the control room? Do you remember?
Yeah. I would kind of go down and say hi and, listen to it down there.
Yeah.
Which is always nice first.
Yeah.
Then you go up and see what the engineers are making of it.
Yeah.
They'd put it all together, put the right little bits of fairy dust on it.
Yeah.
Once the arrangement was settled and George Martin had completed the score, the song's recording was set for April 28th. The session involved 8 classical musicians, alongside Paul, John, and the EMI production team of George Martin, Jeff Emmerich, and Phil McDonald. The group assembled at EMI Studio 2, and it took just under 3 hours to perfect the recording. While George Martin conducted the musicians, Paul and John mainly observed from the control room. Paul had instructed the strings to have a biting sound, and Jeff Emmerich took note of this. Traditionally, string quartets were recorded using just 1 or 2 microphones placed high in the air to avoid picking up the sound of bow scrapes. However, with Paul's request in mind, Emmerich decided to place the microphones closer to the instrument, which was a novel approach at the time. The musicians were horrified. One of them gave me a look of disdain, rolled his eyes to the ceiling, and said under his breath, "You can't do that, you know." His words shook my confidence and made me start to second-guess myself, but I carried on regardless, determined to at least hear what it sounded like. I didn't want to make the musicians so uncomfortable that they couldn't give me their best performance, but my job was to achieve what Paul wanted. Given its chaotic genesis, Eleanor Rigby is extraordinarily cogent and concentrated. The face that the heroine keeps in a jar by the door, to mask the despair inadmissible by English middle-class etiquette, remains the single most memorable image in the Beatles' output. Yet the lyrics' televisual vividness is never gratuitous, being consistently at the service of the song's relentless despondency. Eleanor Rigby dies alone because she's unable to tell anyone how she felt. Mackenzie's sermon won't be heard, not that he cares very much about his parishioners, because religious faith has perished along with the communal spirit. No one was saved. Often represented as purveyors of escapist fantasy, the Beatles were, at their best, more poignantly realistic about their society than any other popular artists of their time.
Growing up, I knew a lot of old ladies, partly through what was called Bob a Job Week, when scouts did chores for a shilling. You'd get a shilling for cleaning out a shed or mowing a lawn. I wanted to write a song that would sum them up. Eleanor Rigby is based on an old lady that I got to know very well. I don't even know how I first met Eleanor Rigby, but I would go around to her house, and not just once or twice. I found out that she lived on her own, so I'd go around there and just chat. Later, I would offer to go and get her shopping. She'd give me a list, and I'd bring the stuff back, and we'd sit in her kitchen. Just hearing her stories enriched my soul and influenced the songs I would later write. And it did feel like a breakthrough for me lyrically, more of a serious song. George Martin had introduced me to the string quartet idea through Yesterday. I'd resisted the idea at first, but when it worked, I fell in love with it. So I ended up writing Eleanor Rigby with a string component in mind. When I took the song to George, I said that for accompaniment, I wanted a series of E minor chord stabs. In fact, the whole song is really only 2 chords, C major and E minor. In George's version of things, he conflates my idea of the stabs, and his own inspiration was Bernard Herrmann, who'd written the music for the movie Psycho. George wanted to bring some of that drama into the arrangement. And of course, there's some kind of madcap connection between Eleanor Rigby, an elderly woman left high and dry, and the mummified mother in Psycho. Those opening lines, Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been, lives in a dream. It is a little strange to be picking up rice after a wedding. Does that mean she was a cleaner? Someone not involved? Someone not invited to the wedding? And only viewing the celebrations from afar? Why would she be doing that? I wanted to make it more poignant than her just cleaning up afterwards, so it became more about someone who was lonely, someone not likely to have her own wedding, but only the dream of one.